Have you ever met someone at the exact moment when your heart was too broken to believe again, and theirs was too guarded to try? Carol Walker was freshly divorced, betrayed, and forgotten, receiving a wedding invitation from the man who left her for his assistant. Desperate to protect what little dignity she had left, she made a bold choice to rent a stranger to stand beside her at the wedding she was never meant to attend. Jonathan Hayes was that stranger, but he wasn't just a man for hire. He was hiding something to $1 billion name, a powerful past, and a heart still learning how to feel. Two people, one pretending not to care, one pretending not to be afraid. Now imagine this. What if the person you hired for protection became the one who truly saw you? Would you run from that kind of love, or would you stay, even if it terrified you? If you find this story touching, comment. 1. If you think this video needs improvement, comment 2. Now, lean in. This is a story about dignity, secrets, and the quiet courage to begin again. The envelope sat alone on the worn wooden table, its creamy paper catching the soft yellow glow of the kitchen light. Carol Walker stared at it for a long time, her fingers hovering just above the embossed lettering. She already knew who it was from Mark Spencer, her ex-husband. It wasn't a surprise. She'd heard rumors through old mutual friends, whispers in passing at work, a few awkward texts from well-meaning acquaintances. Still, holding the wedding invitation in her hands felt like reopening a wound she'd spent 2 years trying to let scar. She peeled the envelope open carefully, almost ritualistically, as if bracing for impact might dull the blow. Inside, elegant calligraphy read, "Mark Spencer and Ashley Reed request the honor of your presence at their wedding ceremony, Saturday, April 6th, at the Willow Hill Vineyard, Denver, Co." Carol blinked. Ashley Reed. The 25-year-old assistant who had once giggled too loudly outside Mark's office, the one who called him sir and wore perfume that lingered long after she left the room. The same girl who smiled too brightly at Carol during company dinners, who once brought Mark coffee with 2 sugars, though Carol had always made it with 1. And now, she was becoming his wife. Carol let the invitation fall to the table. It made a soft, final sound not unlike the closing of a door. Outside the window, the Denver sky stretched wide and dusky, tinged with purple and blue. It was early spring, the kind that still carried a chill in the evenings. Inside her small apartment, once meant to be temporary silence, clung to the walls. No footsteps, no laughter, no warm scent of food simmering on the stove, just the slow tick, tick, tick of the clock above the fridge. Carol leaned back against the counter, letting the edge press into her lower back. She wasn't crying. Not really. Her eyes stung. Sure. Her throat tightened. But no tears came. Not yet. It was the kind of sadness that didn't rush out like a storm. It lingered, quiet, heavy, familiar. She had loved Mark deeply, devotedly. She'd met him at 23, married at 26, supported him through law school, cooked dinners at midnight, took temp jobs to help pay the mortgage. They had built a life together, or at least she thought they had. Until one day, he said he was no longer fulfilled, that she was too safe, and that maybe they had grown in different directions. Then, a week later, he moved out. 2 months after that, he brought Ashley to the company's 4th of July party. Carol stayed home that day, feigning illness. Now, 2 years later, he wanted her to attend his wedding, to smile, to clap politely when the officiant said, "You may now kiss the bride." She imagined it, all the eyes, the whispered questions. Is that his ex-wife? The pity, the judgment. the suggestion that she had been the one who let him go. She poured herself a glass of red wine, a cheap bottle she kept around for weekends. It tasted sharp, a little too warm. She didn't care. She walked barefoot into the living room and sank into the couch, the glass cradled in both hands. The invitation lay nearby, glaring at her from the coffee table. She stared at it for a while. The air felt thick. Her shoulders slumped. She leaned her head back and closed her eyes, letting the silence swallow her. Then, softly, almost like a whisper to herself, she said, "I'm not showing up alone." The words surprised her, but once spoken, they rang true. She didn't need revenge. She didn't want to make Mark jealous, but she refused to be pitied. She refused to be that woman, the ex-wife who wilted under shame and silence. Carol opened her laptop. The screen glowed softly in the dim light, reflecting in her tired eyes. She typed, "Slowly but surely event companion for social gathering. Professional, discreet, temporary." Her fingers hovered over the mouse for a moment, then clicked, "Submit." The clock ticked. The wine glass emptied. Outside, the streetlights buzzed as the night deepened. Inside, something stirred within her, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not quite hope, not yet, but maybe the beginning of a story that wasn't about endings. Carol hadn't been on a real date in nearly 2 years. The idea of hiring someone felt absurd at first, cheap, performative, like borrowing confidence that didn't belong to her. But the wedding invitation on her kitchen table hadn't moved, and every time she passed it, it whispered, "You'll be alone. Again." So, one sleepless night, with the hum of her refrigerator and the distant sound of a city not quite asleep, she clicked on the website Event Companions, net a sterile landing page, drop-down filters, a search bar that somehow felt more vulnerable than any dating app she'd ever used. She scrolled. Men in polished suits with rehearsed grins, beach photos, dinner photos, one man posing with a motorcycle, another holding a puppy, too flashy, too fake, too much effort. Then she saw him, Jonathan H., 38, no smile, just a simple headshot, clean-cut, understated, dark blazer, subtle lighting, brown eyes that didn't ask for attention but somehow held it. His bio was sparse, quiet, reliable, respectful, available for formal events and corporate gatherings. No improvisation unless requested. Rate $500 for 4 hours. Area Denver and surrounding. Carol stared at the photo for a long time. No filters, no gimmicks, just stillness. She clicked book appointment. The cafe was small and nondescript, tucked between a used bookstore and a shoe repair shop, the kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. Carol arrived 10 minutes early. She chose a corner seat, facing the door, nerves bundled under her beige sweater. The server offered her a menu. She declined. Just coffee. Black. At exactly 6:30 p.m., the door chimed. She looked up and knew it was him. Jonathan walked in with the calm, unbothered pace of someone who had no need to impress anyone. Dark gray coat, simple jeans, a muted scarf that made his eyes appear even deeper, darker. He saw her, offered a quiet nod, and approached. Carol. His voice was low, smooth-measured, not performative. She nodded. "Jonathan, thanks for being on time. I try not to be late for strangers," he said, settling across from her. There was a pause. Not awkward, just observant. Carol placed her hands around the warm ceramic cup in front of her. "So, here's the deal." She took a breath. "There's a wedding. My ex-husband's. It's next Saturday. Vineyard venue. You'll be my boyfriend of 4 months. We met at a bookstore. I'm an old soul. You recommended Steinbeck. We hit it off. He raised an eyebrow slightly. Very literary. It sounds believable. She shrugged. You're a traveling consultant, work mostly in Seattle. That explains why no one's met you. Got it. He nodded. Do I like red or white wine? She smiled. A small one. Red, full-bodied. Same as me. Jonathan didn't laugh, but there was the faintest curve at the edge of his lips. 4 hours. She continued. We get in, we charm, we get out. No contact afterward. This isn't a rom-com. Understood, he replied. No feelings, no follow-ups, no illusions. Right. She said it too quickly. The server brought his coffee. He took it black, just like hers. Carol noticed, but said nothing. For the next half hour, they ironed out details, names of friends, family dynamics. Carol's favorite flower peony's fake answers are harder to remember. Inside jokes they could allude to, like the time he accidentally spilled coffee on her favorite sweater in the bookstore aisle. It should have felt transactional. Instead, it felt calm. Steady. Grounded. Jonathan wasn't trying to charm her. No fake compliments. No, you're too good for him comments. He just listened, took notes mental. Maybe, or maybe he already remembered it all. When they finished, Carol closed her notebook and glanced up. Any questions? Just one. He said, meeting her eyes for the first time in a sustained, almost unblinking gaze. Do you want to look like you're in love, or just comfortably attached? She paused. What's the difference? People in love still look at each other in crowded rooms. She didn't answer right away. Then, almost softly, let's aim for the latter. As they left the cafe, the wind had picked up, spring trying to chase out the remnants of winter. Carol wrapped her coat tighter. Jonathan didn't offer his, but he walked beside her, no rushing, no lingering, just present. At the end of the block, she turned to him. Thank you for doing this. He gave a slight nod. It's my job. She hesitated. You do this a lot, enough to know how to tell when someone's not just doing this for show. Carol blinked. What do you mean? He shrugged. Some people hire someone to be seen. Others just don't want to be invisible anymore. He didn't wait for a response, just nodded once, turned, and walked away down the quiet Denver street. Carol stood there for a moment longer, her breath visible in the cold air. Something unspoken lingered in her chest. Strangers shouldn't feel familiar, and yet he did. The Willow Hill Vineyard sat just outside the Denver city limits, nestled between rows of blooming dogwoods and sleepy hills soaked in April sunlight. It was elegant, deliberate. Every detail of the wedding was curated, like a magazine spread chic, tasteful, painfully perfect. Carol stepped out of the hired car in a fitted navy dress that brushed just above her knees, heels sinking slightly into the gravel as she adjusted her coat. Beside her, Jonathan straightened his dark blazer, the crisp collar sharp against the clean lines of his jaw. He offered no compliments, no forced small talk. Instead, he simply said, Ready? Carol hesitated, looking toward the open-air ceremony already filling with guests. Old co-workers, college friends, family members she hadn't seen since the divorce. Then she looked at Jonathan. I am now inside. Every pair of eyes noticed them. Some did double takes. Some whispered behind manicured hands. Some smiled with the kind of tight-lipped surprise that made Carol want to vanish. But she didn't. She walked tall, chin level, hand gently tucked around Jonathan's arm. They were seated near the back, in the courtesy row reserved for people whose presence was required out of guilt or tradition. Carol didn't mind. It gave her a better view of everyone watching her. And they were watching. A woman from accounting nudged her husband. The Spencer family matriarch squinted, trying to place the man sitting beside her former daughter-in-law. A bridesmaid whispered something that made the groomsman beside her snort into his champagne. The air was thick with assumptions. Who is he? How did she land him? Isn't she the one Mark left? Then the music started. The crowd rose. Carol stood, exhaling slowly. She braced herself. Ashley appeared, radiant in a lace gown that seemed designed to be posted and reposted on every social feed known to man. She beamed at the guests, her blonde curls perfectly placed. On her arm was Mark, tall, polished, and just the same as he'd always been. Except now. His smile faltered for a second when he saw Carol. His eyes narrowed, brows lifted just slightly. His gaze drifted from Carol's face to Jonathan's hand resting casually on her knee. Carol didn't look away. She met Mark's stare with quiet calm, then turned back to the ceremony without a word. The vows were flowery. "Overwritten!" Ashley cried. Mark wiped her tears like a script. Carol watched in silence. Her chest didn't ache like she expected. Instead, something inside her began to settle. This wasn't hers anymore. It had never really been. At the reception, the questions began. Who's your date? How did you two meet? Is it serious? Jonathan handled it like water rolling off glass. Polite smiles. Short answers. A dry wit that made people laugh just enough to back off. At one point, a man Carol vaguely remembered from Mark's college days leaned in and said, "Well, he's a major upgrade." Carol just smiled, but Jonathan leaned slightly closer and said, "You don't need comparisons to validate your glow." She glanced at him, surprised. "You see a glow. Everyone sees it. They just didn't before." Later. Mark approached. He looked tired, or maybe just confused. "Carol, you look—" "Well, I am," she replied simply. His eyes flicked to Jonathan. "And this is—" Jonathan offered his hand. "Jonathan Hayes." "How do you two know each other?" Carol smiled, the kind of smile that didn't offer answers. "We read a lot of the same books." Mark nodded slowly, processing more than what was said. Then Ashley appeared beside him, wrapping her hand around his arm like possession. She smiled tight. "Didn't expect to see you here, Carol. Brave of you to come alone." Jonathan's hand slid into Carol's, not suddenly, not dramatically, just naturally. Fingers laced. Carol tilted her head slightly, her voice gentle. "I didn't come alone." The rest of the evening blurred. Laughter, music, dancing. But Carol and Jonathan didn't stay for long. They slipped out just after the cake was cut, walking slowly toward the gravel drive, the night air crisp with spring promise. Halfway to the car, Carol stopped. The stars were just starting to peek through the clouds. The scent of blooming vines floated on the breeze. She turned to Jonathan. "You didn't have to hold my hand back there. I know, but I'm glad you did." They stood there for a long moment. No rush, no explanation. The world around them buzzed with celebration behind walls and music, but in that quiet space, between two strangers who had agreed not to feel something unspoken, settled between them. Jonathan didn't speak. He simply held her hand tighter, and that silence was louder than anything else all night. 3 days after the wedding, Carol received a message. Not a long one, just a text that read, "Technically, we still have 45 minutes left. Jonathan." She stared at the screen for a moment, then smiled without meaning to. She typed back, "Is that your way of offering a refund?" Seconds later, another message appeared. "No. Just wondering if you want to use the time." Carol thought about it. The wedding was over. The performance was complete. But somehow, it hadn't felt like acting. Not with him. She replied, "Fine, but I'm picking the place." They met at a small diner just off 6th Avenue, the kind with peeling red booths and milkshake menus stuck in time. It was quiet, familiar, no pretenses. Carol wore a loose cardigan and jeans. Jonathan came in a dark sweater and scuffed boots that didn't look like they belonged to a billionaire. They ordered burgers, fries, and black coffee again, no cream. For a while, they didn't talk, not out of awkwardness, but comfort. The silence didn't demand anything. Eventually, Carol asked, "Do you ever feel like everyone's moved on but you?" Jonathan looked out the window. All the time. They started meeting without planning to. A quick lunch turned into a walk through Cheeseman Park. A rainy afternoon became a conversation over second-hand books and dusty records. He didn't ask her to explain herself. She didn't ask about his past. But slowly, pieces emerged like notes from a quiet melody. Jonathan told her he used to read Raymond Carver when he couldn't sleep. He preferred black and white films because color distracts from the dialogue. He had once lived in New York, but Denver felt quieter, safer. Carol shared her love for classic jazz, her habit of collecting old postcards with no intention to send them. She admitted she used to write poetry in college, but hadn't touched a pen in years. One evening, they sat on a bench overlooking City Park Lake. It was early evening. The sky blushed purple, and the air smelled faintly of pine and car exhaust. Carol pulled her coat tighter. Jonathan offered her his scarf this time, without a word. "Do you believe in second chances?" she asked. He thought for a long moment. "Not always," he said. "But I believe in quiet ones, the kind that don't announce themselves." She turned toward him, studying his profile in the fading light. "You're different than I expected." "What did you expect more?" "Ego. More charm. More pretending." He looked at her then, fully. "What makes you think I'm not pretending?" Carol didn't answer. She just held his gaze. "Because I don't feel invisible when I'm with you." Jonathan said nothing, but his hand brushed against hers on the bench. A simple gesture, not quite holding, not quite accidental. They never labeled what was happening. It wasn't romance, not yet. It wasn't friendship, not quite. It was something slower, gentler, like a plant blooming without sunlight, but still finding its way. Carol started noticing things, how Jonathan always paid attention to details, to pauses, to what people didn't say, how he listened without trying to fix, how he never interrupted her thoughts, even when they wandered, and he noticed her too, how she stirred her coffee 3 times, never more, how she hummed old tunes under her breath when reading, how she spoke more with her eyes than her voice. One night, as they walked past a jazz club on Colfax, she paused. "I used to love this place," she said. Mark hated it, said it was too noisy. Jonathan looked through the fogged-up window. Inside, a saxophone cried gently over the clink of glasses. "Do you want to go in?" Carol hesitated. "Not tonight." Jonathan didn't push. He just nodded, adjusted his scarf, and continued walking beside her. But as they walked away, she smiled, because for the first time in years, someone had offered, not insisted. They didn't make plans. But somehow, they kept showing up. A Sunday morning at the same farmer's market, a Tuesday evening near the library, a Thursday morning at a coffee shop neither of them had visited before, but both walked into at the same time. Fate, maybe. But it felt more like alignment. Something easing into place after years of scraping against the edges. One evening, they ended up on her apartment steps. No kisses. No declarations. Just a quiet pause before goodbye. Jonathan looked at her as if memorizing her face. "Do you regret hiring me?" Carol exhaled, slow and even. "No. I think I regret waiting so long to meet you." He didn't reply, but his smile, the rare, quiet kind, was enough. It was a Wednesday morning, like any other. Carol arrived at work early, as she always did. The office of Bellington Life Insurance was still quiet, just the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sputter of a coffee machine. She settled into her desk with a folder of reports and a lukewarm cup of tea. Routine, safe, predictable. Then Claire from accounting walked by, her phone in hand, a smirk playing on her lips. "You sure know how to pick 'em," she said casually, waving her phone screen toward Carol's face. Carol blinked, confused. Claire flipped the phone around and tapped the screen. A business news site appeared. Front page. Bold letters. Stonebridge Capital acquires stake in Bellington Life. CEO Jonathan Hayes spearheads investment in company turnaround. Under the headline was a high-resolution photo of Jonathan. Crisp suit, familiar eyes, confident stance, exactly the man who had walked her home, held her hand, sat with her in silence, and listened like no one else had. Except now, he wasn't just Jonathan. He was Jonathan Hayes, billionaire, investor, CEO. Carol stared at the photo, her stomach tightening. The article went on to praise the strategic acquisition, noting how Hayes had shown renewed interest in smaller, community-rooted firms, and, somewhere in the middle of the piece, a name leapt out at her. Bellington Life's recent restructuring includes the retention of core administrative staff, notably longtime executive assistant Carol Walker, her name, in print, in his world, without her knowing. She didn't respond to Claire. She just stood, walked calmly to the elevator, and pressed the button with a hand that suddenly didn't feel like her own. By the time Jonathan answered her call, she was already waiting at the park. Same bench as before, the one that overlooked the lake. He arrived quietly, as he always did. But this time, she didn't look up. Why, she asked, voice low. Jonathan took a breath. "I didn't plan it like this." Carol finally looked at him. The hurt in her eyes was sharp, cutting through the quiet. "You didn't plan for me to find out, or you didn't plan to lie. I never lied," he said gently. "I just didn't tell you everything." She stood, her arms folded. "You knew where I worked. You knew what that place meant to me. And you just what bought in behind my back." Jonathan's voice remained steady. "It wasn't about you. At first, I had been considering the company for months. You and I happened after. But you didn't stop," she said. "You didn't think maybe I deserved to know, that maybe I wouldn't want to date someone who holds power over my future." He flinched, just slightly. "I wasn't trying to hold power. I wasn't trying to interfere." "You did interfere," she snapped. "You crossed into my world and made decisions without giving me the truth. You sat with me. You walked beside me. You asked for my trust while keeping yours locked up behind a polished smile and a sanitized story." Jonathan stepped closer, slower. "I wasn't pretending, Carol. Not with you." She shook her head, biting back the tears. "You didn't let me choose. You just decided for both of us." A gust of wind stirred the early leaves on the ground. The lake rippled. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed. The world moved on, but Carol didn't. She stared at him one last time. "I don't know who you are, Jonathan, and maybe I never did." Then she turned and walked away, heels crunching softly on the gravel path, heart pounding hard enough to drown the silence he left behind. Jonathan didn't follow. He stood alone, hands in his pockets, gaze lowered. The woman who had once made him believe in second chances had just walked out of his reach, and this time he knew it was his fault. By Friday, the whispers were no longer whispers. They came in thinly veiled glances, hushed tones that stopped when Carol entered the room, and the subtle shifting of shoulders in the break room. She felt it before she heard it. The space she once moved through quietly had turned cold. Heavy. Claire from accounting spoke louder than usual that morning, her voice trailing into the hallway. Well, it's no wonder she survived the restructuring if he was backing her. Carol paused mid-step. The sting of the words didn't come all at once. It settled slowly like ice spreading across glass. At her desk, an envelope sat with her name scribbled on it. No stamp, no return address. She opened it carefully. Inside, a printed page, a screenshot of the news article with Jonathan's face, and a yellow highlighter circling one line. Stonebridge Capital's involvement led to the retention of select key staff. Underneath, in pen, must be nice to have friends in high places. No signature, just venom. At 10:15 a.m., Carol's phone buzzed. Ms. Walker, please come to conference room 3. It was from HR. She felt the air tighten around her as she rose from her chair. All eyes stayed down, pretending to be busy. No one offered a smile. No one asked if she was okay. The walk to the conference room felt longer than usual. Her heels sounded too loud on the tile. Inside, 2 people waited: Sandra from HR and Richard Lawson, one of the senior partners. They gestured for her to sit. Neither of them smiled. Carol, Sandra began, her tone too calm. This isn't a formal accusation, just an internal review. Carol stayed quiet. Given the recent media coverage surrounding Mr. Hayes and his connection to Stonebridge Capital, Richard continued, we're receiving questions from both internal staff and stakeholders about the nature of your relationship with him. Carol blinked. Excuse me. Sandra leaned forward slightly. It's been brought to our attention that there was familiarity observed. At the wedding and afterward, Carol felt her jaw tighten. You're interrogating me because I attended my ex-husband's wedding with a date. It's more than that, Richard said. The board wants to ensure there were no conflicts of interest, that your position here was not influenced. Influenced, she almost laughed, but it stuck in her throat. You think I seduced an investor to keep my job as an executive assistant? Neither of them answered. I didn't know who he was when I met him, she said, voice low but steady. I didn't even know about the investment until you told me. Sandra tapped her pen against the folder. That may be, but perception matters. And unfortunately, this situation has created discomfort. Carol felt her cheeks flush, not with guilt, but with humiliation. Discomfort for people who can't imagine I was kept on because I'm good at what I do? We're not saying that, Richard said quickly. But we do need to consider what's best for company transparency. The word hung there like a verdict. Transparency. Translation. You're making people talk, and that makes us nervous. Carol stared at the table. It was clean, impersonal, like the conversation. I've worked here for 8 years, she said quietly. I've never missed a deadline. I've taken late calls, canceled vacations, trained new hires without being asked. Sandra gave a soft, rehearsed nod. We recognize your contributions, Carol, but the room already felt like goodbye. 15 minutes later, Carol stood in the women's restroom, gripping the edge of the sink. Her reflection stared back at her, eyes rimmed red, jaw clenched, a version of herself she barely recognized. She turned on the faucet, letting cold water rush over trembling fingers. I didn't do anything wrong, she whispered, but the doubt crept in anyway. Maybe she should have known. Maybe she should have asked more questions. Maybe falling for someone even by accident was a luxury she wasn't allowed. Her breath hitched. Tears slid down, soundless. She covered her mouth and leaned over the sink, heart pounding. What did I do wrong by the end of the day? She had made her decision. She returned to her desk, opened a blank Word document, and began to type, subject formal resignation. Carol Walker. Her fingers didn't hesitate. No bitterness, no defense, just clarity. As she packed the few things she had, photos, notebooks, her mug that read, "Ask me after coffee," no one spoke to her, except Claire, who paused near the door and said with a syrupy voice, "Guess he couldn't save you after all." Carol didn't respond. She didn't need to, because walking away wasn't weakness. It was choosing peace over permission. She pressed the elevator button with steady fingers. The doors opened, and for the first time in weeks, she breathed. The boardroom had never been that quiet. 8 people sat around the long mahogany table, shuffling papers and pretending not to glance at the man standing at the head. Jonathan Hayes. He wasn't in disguise this time. No neutral sweaters, no denim jackets. Today, he wore who he was: sharply tailored charcoal suit, polished shoes, tie clipped perfectly. Stonebridge Capital's CEO, billionaire investor, known for calculated moves and colder strategies. But there was something different about him now. A heat beneath the stillness. A purpose that wasn't in his usual playbook. He placed both palms gently on the table, eyes steady. "Let's be clear," he began. "This isn't about a scandal. This is about a woman, one you've misjudged." No one interrupted. He continued, "Carol Walker didn't pursue me. She didn't manipulate me. She didn't ask for favors. If anything," he paused, just long enough for the silence to stretch, "I was the one who asked for her time." Somewhere near the end of the table, Richard Lawson adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Hayes, we understand your position, but from an optics standpoint," Jonathan cut in, calmly but without apology. "Optics. You're worried about gossip, not facts. Let me give you the facts." He reached into his briefcase, pulled out a small folder, and opened it with precision. "This is the internal report from our compliance team. Every move I've made regarding Bellington Life was cleared by our ethics advisors. The investment was evaluated months before I met Carol. And here," he flipped a page, "is the email trail between me and your board discussing the acquisition. Carol's name never appears. Not once." He closed the folder. "There is no conflict of interest. There is only your discomfort with the idea that a woman like her might be chosen not because of who she knows, but because of who she is." Silence fell again. It was the kind that made people avoid eye contact, the kind that peeled truth back like paint from old walls. Jonathan looked each person in the eye, one by one. "She's the most capable person I've met in that office. She doesn't complain. She doesn't manipulate. She shows up early, stays late, and makes things run smoother without asking for credit." He exhaled slowly. "And now she's gone, because you didn't trust her to stand on her own, because the easiest story to believe was the one that made her small." Richard tried again. "With respect, Mr. Hayes, we acted based on company policy." Jonathan raised a hand, not sharply, but with authority. "Then consider this my official statement." He stepped away from the table. The room seemed to shrink around him. "If Carol Walker is not reinstated and publicly cleared of any wrongdoing, Stonebridge Capital will withdraw its entire investment, effective immediately." Gasps weren't audible, but the tension rippled like a dropped stone in still water. "I don't bluff," he added. "I build, or I walk away." He let it linger, then stepped toward the door, but before leaving, He turned back. His voice softened, not weaker, but more human. Some people are worth risking everything for, and if you don't see that, then maybe you were never worth her loyalty in the first place. Then he left. No security guards. No entourage. Just one man walking out of a room full of people who suddenly realized what integrity looked like. Outside, the wind pushed gently through the parking lot. Jonathan stood by his car for a moment, hands in his pockets. He didn't know if she'd forgive him. He didn't know if she even wanted to see him again, but she deserved to be defended, and this was not about him anymore. Somewhere inside. The board began making calls. Some red faces leaned into conference phones. Legal scrambled to verify his threat. PR whispered about statements, but none of that mattered, because what he'd done couldn't be spun. He hadn't fought with money. He'd fought with truth. And truth, when spoken with heart, was the most powerful thing in any room. The email confirming her resignation was brief. 2 sentences. No farewell party. No hallway goodbyes. Just a quiet click of send and the sound of a printer spitting out her final HR form. Carol left the Bellington office at 6:14 p.m. No one watched her go. No one held the elevator door. And she didn't look back. The days that followed blurred into one another. She tried to keep busy laundry, groceries, reading novels she never finished. She organized the spice rack, cleaned behind the fridge, rearranged her books alphabetically, then chronologically, then by color. But still, every evening, as the sun dipped behind the Denver skyline, the apartment grew heavier, too still, too clean, too quiet. She didn't hear from Jonathan, and she didn't reach out either. Not because she didn't want to, but because some goodbyes don't need words. They just settle. On a Thursday night, almost a week later. She opened her hallway closet to grab a scarf. And there it was. His. Folded carelessly over the back of the coat rack. Soft gray wool. Faint scent of his cologne still clinging. Jonathan's scarf. The one he'd given her at the lake when the wind turned cold. The one he'd worn every time they met after that. She froze, fingertips brushing the fabric. And then, just like that, she broke. She slid down the wall, pulling the scarf to her chest like it was still part of him. Tears came fast, uninvited, the kind of crying that didn't come from heartbreak, but from exhaustion, from holding it all together too long. "I didn't want to fall for you," she whispered into the wool. "But I did, and I don't know how to forget you." No one answered. Just the soft hum of the refrigerator and the creak of an old pipe. The apartment didn't argue. It had heard her before. Across town, in a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows, Jonathan sat alone. The skyline blinked quietly behind him, tiny stars trapped in glass and steel. His laptop sat open, but the screen had dimmed. He hadn't typed anything in hours. Instead, he stared at a small folder tucked inside the corner of his screen. Carol, JPG. It wasn't a posed photo, just a quiet moment from the wedding reception. She had been laughing at something, head tilted, hand midair, eyes soft. He had taken it without her knowing. He'd never shared it, never posted it, never even printed it. He just kept it. Proof that it had been real. That somewhere in the blur of responsibility and reputation and all the things he'd built, she had happened, and she had changed him. He could have called. He almost did twice, but each time he hesitated, because what could he say that wouldn't sound like justification? And she deserved more than reasons. She deserved space, truth, a life not defined by anyone but herself. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. "You were the only thing I never planned," he whispered. The office stayed silent, not cold, not cruel, just alone. Outside, the city kept breathing. Cars passed, lights flickered, people moved forward. But in two corners of Denver, a woman curled around a scarf that smelled like yesterday, and a man stared at a moment he couldn't go back to, both aching, both silent, and both wondering, would love find its way again? Even after goodbye, the invitation came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. No fancy envelope, just a clean white card slipped into her mailbox, tucked between bills and coupons. She almost didn't open it, but the return address caught her eye. Walk Again Foundation, empowering women after divorce. She opened the card slowly, fingertips grazing the embossed letters. Dear Ms. Carol Walker, you are warmly invited to the inaugural fundraiser of Walk Again, a foundation dedicated to helping women rediscover their strength, rebuild their futures, and reclaim their voices after divorce. Your presence would mean a great deal to us. Sincerely, Jonathan Hayes. Founder Carol stared at the signature for a long time. No message, no explanation, just an invitation. But somehow, it said more than any apology ever could. She folded the card gently, placed it on the table, and sat beside it. The event was held at an old art gallery downtown, newly restored with soft lighting and warm acoustics. No red carpets, no press, just community faces of all ages, most of them women. The walls were lined with photos of women laughing, dancing, hugging children, writing poetry, starting over. Each one was captioned with a single word: again, still, more, enough. Carol walked slowly through the gallery, heels clicking quietly against polished wood floors. She felt underdressed, overdressed, unsure, but no one stared. And when she reached the last photo, one of a woman in her 50s, holding her first paycheck from a new job, she smiled. It wasn't pity, it wasn't sorrow, it was recognition. The room hushed as Jonathan stepped onto the small stage. No spotlight, just soft, natural light from the arched windows behind him. He wore a dark blazer over an open-collar shirt, no tie, no microphone, just his voice. I never thought I'd be here, he began, his voice steady but quiet. Because for most of my life, I believed in starting things with strategy, with certainty, with control. A small laugh rippled through the crowd. But life, especially love, doesn't care much for strategy. It unravels you. It humbles you. He paused. Some time ago, I met someone who changed everything for me. She didn't ask to be seen. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She just showed up, fully herself, strong, quiet, honest. Carol stood near the back, her breath caught. He looked out across the room, never scanning, never searching, just present. She reminded me that love doesn't begin with grand gestures. It begins where ego ends, where listening matters more than winning, where showing up matters more than saving face. Silence held the room. Then he smiled gently. Walk Again isn't just about second chances. It's about first steps back to yourself. And tonight is only the beginning. Applause came slowly, then all at once. Not thunderous, just real. Hands clapping for each other, for themselves, for beginning again. After the speech, Carol moved toward the refreshments table, unsure whether to stay or leave. A hand brushed her arm gently. She turned. Jonathan stood there, just a few feet away. No smile at first, just an almost imperceptible softening in his eyes. Neither of them spoke, because this wasn't a moment that needed words. Everything had already been said, in silences, in scarves, in missed calls, in the decision to show up anyway. They looked at each other for what felt like a full season, and when she finally did smile just a little, he let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I wrote something for the speech," he said quietly. "But I couldn't say it out loud. Not yet." He handed it to her, fingers lingering. Carol took it, eyes never leaving his. "Thank you," she whispered. Jonathan nodded. "I'm not here to ask for anything. I just wanted to meet you again." Without the noise, she nodded, tears stinging gently at the corners of her eyes. "Maybe this time," she said softly, "we'll both walk in with open hands." He smiled. "No contracts, no pretending, no hiding," she added. They didn't hug, they didn't kiss. They just stood shoulder to shoulder, letting the silence fill the space between them with something stronger than closure, something called beginning. 1 year later. Carol Walker stood on a small stage in the center of the very gallery where it all began. But tonight, she wasn't a guest. She wasn't hiding behind a borrowed invitation or folding into a quiet corner. She was the host, the new executive director of Walk Again Foundation. The room filled with warm applause as she stepped to the microphone. Her dress was simple cream with soft sleeves, her hair pulled back, her voice steady. "A year ago. I walked into this room carrying more silence than I knew what to do with." She began, her eyes scanning the crowd. But silence isn't always empty. Sometimes it's just a space waiting to be filled with the right words. A smile tugged gently at her lips. "This year, we helped 83 women start again. Some got new jobs, some found housing, some left unhealthy marriages. But all of them, every single one, found their voice. Applause again, real, full." She stepped down, hugged one of the volunteers, and made her way toward the back of the room. Jonathan was already waiting. He stood near the last photo on the wall, a new one. It showed Carol, not speaking, not smiling, just listening, sitting beside a woman in her 60s, hand on hers, still and strong, underneath, a single caption present. When Carol reached him, Jonathan turned with that same quiet warmth she'd grown to love, not grand, not rehearsed, just his. "They really like you," he said softly. "I guess they like second chances," she replied. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Carol's heart paused. He didn't go down on one knee, didn't ask for a spotlight. Instead, he opened the box and held it between them. Inside, a ring. Simple, elegant. And on the inside of the band, engraved with soft precision, $500. My best investment. Carol let out a breath of laugh wrapped in a tear. "You remembered. Every word," he said. "Every silence, too." She looked at the ring, then at him. There was no question, no hesitation, only choice. She nodded. Yes. He smiled. Not triumphant, not relieved. Just home. He slid the ring onto her finger, and in that moment, nothing else existed. Not old gossip. Not past pain. Not the office politics or the doubts or the missteps. Just this. Two people who had once met on terms they didn't choose, now choosing freely to stay. Later that evening, as the last of the guests drifted out and the lights dimmed to their softest glow, Carol stood by the large window overlooking downtown Denver. She watched the city breathe, slow and steady. Jonathan came up behind her, wrapping his coat gently around her shoulders. "You're warm," she said. "So are you," he whispered. They stood in silence, letting the moment settle. She hired a stranger to protect her dignity, but found someone who gave her back her worth, And in the quiet that followed the chaos, she learned that real love doesn't arrive loudly. It waits. It listens. And when the time is right, it asks nothing, but shows up anyway. There were no more what-ifs, no more maybes, just two souls, wiser, softer, stronger, walking forward, together. In life, dignity and love often feel like two roads that don't meet. We've all been taught to be strong, to keep our heads high, even when our hearts are breaking. But sometimes healing begins not in silence, but in allowing ourselves to be seen. Carol's story reminds us that it's never too late to begin again, that after betrayal, heartbreak, or years of feeling invisible, there's still room for connection, for someone to look at us and say, "You're still worth it." Jonathan's journey shows us that power and success mean very little without humility. True love doesn't arrive with noise or grand gestures. It walks in quietly, often disguised as a second chance. Whether you're starting over at 30 or 60, this story gently tells us we are never too old to be loved for who we truly are. So if you're holding back, waiting for the right moment to trust again, maybe that moment is now. Thank you so much for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, even just a little, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone who needs hope, and subscribing to our channel for more soul-stirring stories. Every click, every comment, every share helps us keep telling stories that matter. From our hearts to yours, thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story.